Darkness Unveiled, The Demon Doctor of Paris. The complete story of Marcel Petiot. In the spring of 1944, thick black smoke poured from a chimney on Rue Le Sueur in occupied Paris. The smell was unbearable, a sickly, sweet stench that clung to the air like a curse. When firefighters broke down the door, they found a pit of human remains, bones, skulls, decomposing limbs stacked like firewood. And the man who owned the building? He was a respected physician, a doctor who had sworn an oath to do no harm. His name was Marcel Petiot, and before the Nazis could claim their title as the greatest monsters of the era, this Frenchman was building his own private empire of death, one patient at a time. Paris during World War II was a city of shadows. Under the boot of Nazi occupation, ordinary citizens lived in a perpetual state of fear, hunger, and moral compromise. The Gestapo patrolled the boulevards, collaborators whispered in cafes, and desperate people, Jews, resistance fighters, criminals, anyone with reason to flee, searched frantically for escape routes out of France. It was a world where trust was the most dangerous commodity, and desperation made people vulnerable to the worst kinds of predators. Into this chaos stepped Dr. Marcel Petiot, a man whose charm was matched only by his cunning and whose medical degree provided the perfect mask for something far more sinister. He promised salvation to those who needed it most. He offered a way out, passage to South America, to freedom, to a life beyond the reach of the Third Reich. Dozens of people believed him. They packed their bags, they gathered their valuables, they walked through his door, and they were never seen again. This is the story of one of France's most prolific serial killers, a man who exploited the darkest chapter in European history to satisfy his own monstrous appetites, a man who turned wartime suffering into a killing machine, a man who, even when the evidence was undeniable, almost got away with all of it. Marcel André Henri Félix Petiot was born on January 17, 1897, in Auxerre, a quiet town in the Burgundy region of France. From the very beginning, there was something deeply wrong with him. Childhood acquaintances would later recall a boy who was not merely mischievous, but genuinely disturbing. He tortured animals. He stole from classmates. He was expelled from school multiple times for behavioral problems that went far beyond adolescent rebellion. Teachers noted a strange duality in young Marcel. He was remarkably intelligent, even brilliant, but behind those sharp eyes lurked something cold, something calculating, something that didn't quite register as human. Was he born this way? Or did the world shape him into what he would become? When World War I erupted across Europe in 1914, Petiot was conscripted into the French army. He served in the trenches, where he witnessed and participated in the mechanized slaughter that defined the Western Front. During his service, he was wounded and also reportedly suffered from mental breakdowns. He was treated in several psychiatric facilities where doctors diagnosed him with a range of personality disorders. Some noted his manipulative behavior, others documented his pathological lying. But the war needed soldiers more than it needed diagnoses, and Petiot was eventually returned to duty, then honorably discharged. After the war, Petiot did something that would surprise no one familiar with the psychology of narcissistic predators. He pursued a career that would grant him authority, respectability, and access to vulnerable people. He enrolled in medical school, and despite his troubled psychiatric history, despite the documented evidence that this man was deeply unstable, he earned his degree. In 1921, Dr. Marcel Petiot hung his shingle and began practicing medicine in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, a small town where his charm and intelligence quickly won over the local population. He was charismatic, magnetic even. Patients adored him. He offered reduced fees to the poor. He made house calls at odd hours. He listened, he smiled. He prescribed generously, perhaps too generously. Rumors circulated that Petiot was overprescribing narcotics and that some of his patients had developed addictions. Darker whispers suggested that a young woman who had been romantically involved with him had simply vanished. But these were whispers. And in a small French town, whispers could be explained away. Petiot's ambitions extended beyond medicine. He entered local politics, and in 1927 he was elected mayor of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. Think about that for a moment. A man who had been institutionalized for mental illness, who was suspected of theft, who may have been connected to a disappearance. This man convinced an entire town to elect him as their leader. It speaks to the terrifying power of a well-constructed mask. Petiot's public persona was impeccable. He was the devoted doctor, the civic leader, the man of the people. But his tenure as mayor was not without scandal. He was accused of embezzling public funds. He was caught stealing from the town's coffers. There were allegations of illegal drug trafficking. A political rival who threatened to expose him died under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled an accident, but the timing was, to say the least, convenient. Eventually, the scandals caught up with him, and Petiot left Villeneuve-sur-Yonne under a cloud of suspicion. But he was not defeated. He was not even slowed down. In 1933, Marcel Petiot moved to Paris, the largest city in France, a metropolis of millions, where a man with his particular talents could disappear into the crowd and find an endless supply of new victims. He set up a medical practice at 66 Rue de Caumartin, and once again, the patients came. Once again, the charm worked. Once again, the mask held perfectly in place. But now the stage was larger, the opportunities were greater, and the darkness that had always lived inside Marcel Petiot was about to find the perfect conditions in which to bloom. When Nazi Germany occupied France in June 1940, the country was split in two, the northern zone under direct German control and the southern Vichy regime, a puppet state that collaborated with its occupiers. Paris fell under the shadow of the swastika. Jewish citizens were forced to register with authorities. Curfews were imposed. The Gestapo established headquarters throughout the city, and for anyone targeted by the Nazi regime, Jews, political dissidents, resistance members, criminals, escape became a matter of life and death. This was the world Marcel Petiot had been waiting for, not consciously perhaps. But the occupation created a perfect ecosystem for a predator of his specific design. Desperate people with money and valuables needed to disappear. They needed someone they could trust, someone with connections, someone with a plan. And who better to trust than a doctor? Petiot began spreading word through the Parisian underworld that he was connected to an escape network. He called it Fly. He claimed it was a resistance organization that could smuggle people out of France, through Spain or Portugal, and eventually to Argentina or other South American countries. The process was straightforward, he explained. You come to me, you bring your valuables, cash, gold, jewels, to fund the journey. You receive your vaccinations because South American countries require inoculations for entry. And then one night, you vanish from Paris and reappear in a new life, free from the Nazis, free from danger. It was a beautiful lie, and for people living under the daily threat of deportation to concentration camps, it was irresistible. Who were Petiot's victims? They were, for the most part, people already living on the margins of occupied Paris. Jewish families who had seen their neighbors rounded up and shipped east to destinations unknown, criminals and black marketeers who had run afoul of both the Germans and the French police, prostitutes, drug dealers, people whose disappearance would not raise immediate alarms, because in occupied Paris, people disappeared all the time. The Gestapo took them. The resistance recruited them. They fled to the countryside. There were 1,000 explanations for a missing person, and none of them involved a smiling doctor with a needle. Petiot had purchased a townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur, an elegant address in the 16th arrondissement. To the outside world, it appeared to be a secondary property, perhaps an investment. Inside, Petiot had made very specific modifications. He had constructed a triangular room, a small sealed chamber with a heavy door and a peephole. He had installed a furnace in the basement. The modifications were clinical, deliberate, designed with a single purpose in mind. The victims would arrive at Rue Le Sueur, often at night, carrying everything they owned. Petiot would greet them warmly. He would explain the next steps. He would administer an injection, the required vaccination for their journey, and then the poison would take hold. Some researchers believe Petiot used cyanide. Others suggest he may have used strychnine or other lethal compounds. Whatever the substance, the result was the same. The patients would collapse. They would convulse. They would die. And Petiot would watch through the peephole of his triangular room, observing the final moments of human beings who had come to him begging for salvation. Then came the disposal. The bodies were dismembered. They were dissolved in quicklime. They were burned in the basement furnace. The valuables, the cash, the gold, the jewelry that was supposed to fund a new life went straight into Petiot's pockets. He was not merely killing people. He was consuming them, their hope, their money, their very existence. How many people walked through the door at 21 Rue Le Sueur and never walked out? That question would haunt investigators for years. On March 11, 1944, something went wrong at 21 Rue Le Sueur. The neighbors had been complaining about the smell for days, a thick, acrid odor that seeped through the walls and hung in the streets. And now, black smoke was billowing from the chimney. Dense, greasy, unmistakable smoke. A neighbor called the police. The police called the fire department. And when the firefighters arrived and forced their way into the building, they found something that would sear itself into the memory of every person present. The basement was a charnel house. In the furnace and scattered around the room were human remains in various states of decomposition and incineration. Skulls, rib cages, a pile of bones so large it seemed impossible that they could belong to just one person, or even 5. Quicklime had been spread across the floor. The walls were stained with substances that the firefighters did not want to identify. The stench was overwhelming. One officer reportedly staggered outside and vomited in the street. Another simply stared, unable to process what he was seeing. The police traced the property to Dr. Marcel Petiot. Officers went to his home, but Petiot had already been alerted, reportedly by the police themselves, in a twist that reveals just how chaotic and corrupt law enforcement was during the occupation. When officers initially arrived at the scene, they had actually contacted Petiot before fully investigating, and he had hurried to the townhouse. What happened next was almost unbelievable. Standing in front of the officers, surrounded by the evidence of mass murder, Petiot leaned in close and whispered that the bodies belonged to Germans and collaborators. He claimed he was a resistance fighter. He said these were enemies of France, executed in the name of liberation. And then, incredibly, the officers let him go. Let that sink in. The police found a basement full of human remains, and the man responsible talked his way out of the building and disappeared into the streets of occupied Paris. But the investigation did not end there. As detectives began examining the remains more closely, the scope of Petiot's crimes became horrifyingly clear. Forensic teams recovered the remains of at least 10 individuals in the initial search, but evidence suggested the number was far higher. Suitcases were found, dozens of them, filled with clothing. Men's suits, women's dresses, children's shoes. Each suitcase represented a person. Each set of clothing represented a life extinguished. Personal items were cataloged, identity documents, photographs, letters. These were not German soldiers or Nazi collaborators. These were civilians. Many were Jewish. The investigation was complicated by the political situation. France was still under German occupation, and the Gestapo had their own interest in Petiot. They had actually arrested him in 1943 on suspicion of helping people escape France, which, from the German perspective, was a crime. The Gestapo had interrogated and tortured him, but Petiot had revealed nothing, and he was eventually released. This detail would later become crucial because it gave Petiot a claim, however distorted, to resistance credentials. He had been arrested by the Nazis. He had been tortured. In the eyes of some, this made him a patriot. Meanwhile, Parisian detectives began tracking the missing persons whose belongings had been found at Rue Le Sueur. They identified Joachim Gushinov, a furrier. They identified the Neller family, a couple, and their young son. They identified Jean-Marc Van Bever and Martha Kaitf, who had vanished months earlier. Each trail led back to the same source, Dr. Petiot and his supposed escape network. Each victim had told friends or family that they were leaving France through a special contact, a doctor who could arrange everything. Each victim had packed their bags and walked into the night. None had ever sent word from South America. None had ever been heard from again. The hunt for Marcel Petiot became one of the most urgent criminal investigations in French history. But finding a single man in a country torn apart by war and occupation was no simple task. Petiot had vanished completely. Paris was liberated in August 1944. The swastika flags came down. The tricolor went up. And in the chaotic, euphoric, vengeful aftermath of liberation, Marcel Petiot performed what may have been his most audacious act of deception yet. He reinvented himself as a resistance hero. Using forged documents and a carefully constructed false identity, Petiot joined the Free French forces under the name Captain Henri Valery. He grew a beard. He adopted the mannerisms of a seasoned guerrilla fighter. He spoke passionately about the liberation. And he was, by all accounts, convincing enough to be assigned to military intelligence units tasked with rooting out collaborators. Consider the grotesque irony. The man who had murdered dozens of people, many of them Jews fleeing the very regime France had just overthrown, was now posing as a hero of the liberation, sitting in judgment of others accused of wartime crimes. But the investigation into the horrors at Rue Le Sueur had not stopped. Detective Commissaire Georges Massou, the lead investigator, had spent months building a case. He had identified dozens of potential victims. He had traced financial transactions, large deposits into Petiot's bank accounts that coincided with the disappearances of specific individuals. He had interviewed surviving family members, friends, and associates of the missing. The picture that emerged was damning, comprehensive, and deeply disturbing. Petiot's so-called fly network was a complete fabrication. There was no escape route. There were no contacts in South America. There was no organization. There was only Petiot, his needle, and his furnace. Every person who had entrusted their life to this man had walked into a death trap, and the valuables they had brought, their life savings in many cases, had been systematically looted. In October 1944, a newspaper published an article that inadvertently flushed Petiot from hiding. A former patient recognized the details and contacted authorities. Additional tips followed. Military intelligence began to realize that their captain, Henri Valery, had a suspicious familiarity with details that only Marcel Petiot would know. On October 31st, 1944, Halloween, as if fate had a sense of theatrical timing, Marcel Petiot was arrested at a Paris metro station. He was carrying a revolver, a large sum of cash, and 50 forged identity documents. When confronted with the evidence, Petiot did not crumble. He doubled down. He insisted that every person he had killed was a German agent, a collaborator, or an enemy of France. He claimed a body count of 63, not as a confession of murder, but as a boast of patriotic service. He said he had done what needed to be done for the resistance. He looked investigators in the eye and dared them to prove otherwise. The trial of Marcel Petiot began on March 18, 1946, at the Palais de Justice in Paris, the same building where Marie Antoinette had been condemned to death over a century before. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from around the world jammed the press gallery. The French public, still reeling from 4 years of occupation and the revelations of the Holocaust, watched with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Petiot was charged with 27 counts of murder, though investigators believe the true number was far higher, possibly 60 or more. The prosecution, led by State Attorney Pierre Dupin, presented a mountain of evidence. The human remains found at Rue Le Sueur, the personal belongings of identified victims, the financial records showing Petiot's enrichment, and the testimony of witnesses who had narrowly escaped his web. But Petiot was not a passive defendant. He was theatrical, arrogant, and at times darkly comedic. He interrupted witnesses, he mocked the prosecution, he corrected the judge on points of law. He delivered eloquent speeches about his service to France, painting himself as a misunderstood patriot who had fought the Nazis in his own way. When confronted with the names of Jewish victims, he claimed they were actually German spies posing as Jews. When asked about the triangular room with the peephole, he said it was for observing enemy agents. For every piece of evidence, he had an explanation, absurd, contradictory, but delivered with such confidence that some observers found themselves momentarily swayed. His defense attorney, René Fleuriot, was one of France's most brilliant lawyers, and he fought hard to establish Petiot as a legitimate resistance fighter. Fleuriot called witnesses who testified to Petiot's arrest by the Gestapo, his refusal to cooperate under torture, and his apparent hatred of the German occupiers. The defense argued that the victims were indeed enemies of France, and that Petiot's actions, while extreme, were justified by the extraordinary circumstances of war. But the prosecution systematically dismantled this narrative. Victim after victim was identified not as a German agent, but as an innocent civilian, a Jewish businessman, a young mother, a family trying to survive. The suitcases filled with clothing told their own story, silent testimony from people who had packed for a journey to freedom and instead found only death. The financial evidence was devastating. Petiot had profited enormously from every killing. This was not resistance. This was not patriotism. This was industrialized murder for profit, cloaked in the language of heroism. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Marcel Petiot was found guilty of 26 counts of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to death. On May 25, 1946, Petiot was led to the guillotine at La Santé prison in Paris. According to witnesses, he walked calmly to his execution. He did not tremble. He did not beg. Some accounts suggest he smiled. His last words, reportedly directed at his executioner, were, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look. This will not be pretty." The blade fell. Marcel Petiot was dead at the age of 49. In the aftermath, investigators estimated that Petiot had murdered at least 60 people, though the exact number has never been conclusively established. Some historians place the figure closer to 150. The valuables he stole from his victims were valued at approximately 200 million francs, a fortune by the standards of the era. Much of this wealth was never recovered. The house at 21 Rue Le Sueur was demolished. The triangular room, the furnace, the peephole, all of it erased from the physical landscape of Paris, though not from its memory. Petiot's name entered the lexicon of French crime alongside Landru and other notorious killers, but his case carried a particular weight because he had not merely exploited human weakness. He had exploited the most catastrophic event in modern European history. The case of Marcel Petiot forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the conditions that allow it to flourish. Petiot was not a product of the Nazi occupation. He was a predator long before the first German soldier marched into Paris. But the occupation gave him something invaluable, a perfect hunting ground, a city full of desperate people, a breakdown of law and order, a fog of war thick enough to conceal almost anything. His victims trusted him because they had no choice. When the world itself becomes a trap, you will follow anyone who promises a way out. Petiot understood this instinct, and he weaponized it with surgical precision. What disturbs most about this case is not the violence, though it was monstrous. It is the mask, the doctor's coat, the warm smile, the reassuring words. Petiot moved through society as a healer, a leader, a patriot. He fooled patients, voters, police officers, military officials, and even the Gestapo. The very systems designed to protect people failed spectacularly over and over again, because they could not see past the disguise. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. In times of crisis, when the rules of civilization break down, how do we distinguish the people trying to save us from the people trying to devour us? And if we can't tell the difference, what does that say about the fragility of everything we call society? If this story moved you, subscribe to Darkness Unveiled, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the past speaks if we're willing to listen. Until next time, stay in the light.